My friend and fellow podcaster KMO once told me that after attending many lectures and events in New York City, and particularly after going to a seminar that was advertised on Foursquare as providing a critical examination of digital culture and social media, he had come up with a new rule of thumb. If a speaker at a left-wing event used the word imaginary as a noun, he would walk out. Such people, leftist experts he called them, were incapable of thinking or speaking clearly, but could only talk in a lingo meant to indicate their membership in the tribe of the educated left. People who would use the term imaginary as a noun instead of as an adjective were invariably a waste of time. Despite my Gen X friend's assessment, the term imaginary still has some cachet and is still bandied about. For example, as recently as early September, Alexandra Maricini published a review of the young adult novel Mordu, entitled Mordu and the New Leftist Imaginary. In it, she wrote about how the book, like Harry Potter before it, was capturing the left's imaginary. Why not the left's imagination? What are people trying to get at when they use the word this way? Just what is the imaginary? Well, there's actually more than one. In fact, each imaginary springs from a different social theory and theorist. If you search for the term in the online Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the first entry you'll find is for Jacques Lacan. In Lacanian theory, the imaginary is one of three registers of cognition or interpretation. According to the philosopher and Lacanian popularizer Slavoj Žižek, one way to understand the imaginary in the context of what's called the Lacanian triad is to consider a commonplace consumer item, like, let's say, a VW Bug. Imagine a car salesman is trying to sell us this car. He might start out by telling us about the car's real attributes. The VW Bug is fuel efficient, it has certain safety features, it comes with a radio and with seat belts, and so on. Or, the salesman might try to sell us the car based on its symbolic meaning. The car is fun. It reflects a certain conception of freedom, but it's also a classic car, and driving one indicates that you aren't caught up in frills or ostentatious displays of wealth, but are rather concerned with those things that are both modern, but which also endure. The salesman might tell you that Donald Trump would never drive a VW Bug. And if the salesman were trying to sell you the car on the basis of the imaginary, he might try to get you to drive the car, and not just to drive it, but to drive it to the right kind of place. With the VW Bug, he might suggest driving the car to a modern art museum, or to a fashion show in a hip neighborhood, or, if he knew you, to your mistress's apartment. He'd get you to associate your little bug with her cute face, and her mod hair, and her short skirt. He wouldn't get you to merely associate the car with sex or with sexual conquest, but with your own personal experience, your own personal inclinations, which perhaps I've revealed too much of just now. This is a stripped-down version of the Lacanian triad, a simplification. Nonetheless, it is a useful place to start as we approach the topic of the imaginary, and specifically as we approach Cornelius Castoriadis' 1975 book, The Imaginary Institution of Society. Cornelius Castoriadis was an anti-Bolshevik French leftist and economist employed by the OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He was a co-founder of the radical group Socialism or Barbarism, and a member of the collective Facing Reality, along with C.L.R. James and Grace Lee Boggs. Through Socialism or Barbarism, he influenced the thinking of Guy Debord, the radical theorist who was often credited with sparking the uprisings and strikes of May 1968. Castoriadis is also credited for introducing the word imaginary as a noun into the supposedly radical discourse. Hello Zero Books readers, it's me again, Douglas Lane, and in this video we'll examine Cornelius Castoriadis' book, The Imaginary Institution of Society. We'll try to discover just what this imaginary is and how it might inform a struggle for socialism, And we'll start in the same way that Castoriadis does. We'll start with a rejection, or his rejection, of Marx.
Το 49 είναι μια στιγμή όπου αυτή η ομάδα και εγώ ο ίδιος θεωρούμε τον εαυτό μας μαρξιστές.
Τώρα?
Εγώ όχι, το έχω γράψει από το 1964 ότι σήμερα μπαίνει το δίλημμα, είναι εξακολουθήσεις να είσαι μαρξιστής ή να είσαι επαναστάτης. Αλλά τα δύο μαζί είναι ασυμβίβαστα, ας πούμε. Διότι ο μαρξισμός έχει γίνει κάτι τελείως διαφορετικό, είναι ένα νεκρό σώμα μιας ψευδοθεωρίας που δεν αναπτύσσεται και το οποίο κοινωνικά και ιστορικά λειτουργεί μόνο και μόνο σαν μια ιδεολογία.
For the last dozen years, Karl Marx has experienced something of a comeback. After the economic crisis of 2008, Charlie has seemed relevant again. Many people on the left have been writing about him, reevaluating his work. One example of this long trend of renewed interest in Marx is Steve Paxton's upcoming book, Unlearning Marx. Paxton takes the opposite perspective from Castoriadis. He argues that the Soviet Union and its collapse should be considered separately from Marx and his theories. In fact, he says that the Soviet Union's collapse confirms Marx's theories. Paxton would have us embrace Marx because the failures of Marxism actually prove Marx was right. Castoriadis, on the other hand, walked away from Marx because of the failures of Marxism that were evident before 1989. He claimed that to reduce Marxism to a set of theories written in the 19th century was to discredit those theories. He wrote, "To want to find the sense of Marxism exclusively in what Marx wrote, ignoring what this doctrine has become in history, is to claim, in direct contradiction to the central ideas of the doctrine, that real history does not count, that the truth of a theory is always and exclusively beyond, and finally, it is to replace revolution by revelation." Castoriadis turns Hegel against the Marx interpreters who understood really existing socialism and the welfare state capitalist countries through Marx's categories. Categories like commodity, socially necessary labor time, variable and fixed capital all had to be abandoned because, as Castoriadis wrote, quoting Hegel, "World history is a world judgment." If Marxist revolutionaries no longer held true or even understood the major categories in Marx's writings, this meant that Marx was no longer relevant to the revolution. If Marxist revolutionaries were inconsistent, if they were only sporadically radical, if the results of their efforts were ambiguous, then this meant that Marx's ideas were ambiguous. Castoriadis wrote that the present carries infinitely greater weight than the past. And by this he meant that given that Marxism was being used as a shield, a way to obscure reality by really existing Marxists, that meant that Marx's ideas themselves were ideological. This interpretation of the role that radical theory plays in world history is idealist in two senses. First, it treats the theories of philosophers, whether they are revolutionaries or not, as determinative rather than treating the theories as arising from a history, and secondly, it overlooks the responsibility of human beings to self-consciously organize and act for their own liberation. "25 years earlier, Castoriadis' comrades from the Facing Reality Collective, that would be CLR James and Grace Lee, had argued that the Soviet Union, being a state capitalist formation, was gripped by every contradiction of capitalism. In fact, according to Lee, James, and Dostoevskaya, the contradictions inherent to capitalism were intensified in the Soviet Union, and again, back in 1950, they predicted that the USSR would not last. In just over a generation, they would be proven right. Now, I could easily spend the rest of this video picking apart the ways Castoriadis misrepresents Marx, and I will return to those mistakes, but for now, I'll just note that even as he attempted to dismiss the need to take up Marx's writings, as he dismissed the need to argue against Marx's arguments, he himself inevitably took them up and argued against them. He ultimately couldn't point to the problems in socialist countries and leave it at that, but instead, He attempted to demonstrate that allegedly Marxist ideas about overproduction, base and superstructure, the forces of production, and so on, were inconsistent or empirically wrong. Again, from our vantage point in 2020, his assertions about the nature of capitalism and his claim that the state had transcended capitalist relations are clearly wrong. What's more interesting, however, is what Castoriadis offers instead of Marxist critique. He suggests that autonomy is the aim of revolution, and after making this suggestion, Castoriadis encounters a philosophical problem. The philosophical concept of autonomy leads directly to a political and social problem. What this problem amounts to is the need for a presupposed justification. Now, in order to understand why freedom or autonomy relies upon an unexamined justification, why freedom needs an unexamined justification, we'll have to return to Lacan's triad, but from the perspective of ordinary or common sense. Again, when we encounter an object, say a consumer item like a Rubik's Cube, we can consider it in three ways. The first way is to consider its practical qualities or its function. In the case of a Rubik's Cube, we might evaluate the stickers and make sure they are firmly attached. We might make sure that the colors are distinguishable from one another. Then we might test how easily the layers of the cube turn. The second way to approach the cube is symbolically. Why would we want a Rubik's Cube? Is owning one a sign of intelligence or an indicator of being old and trapped in the past? If you can solve one, does that show you're smart or that you have too much spare time? Finally, if we are to fully embrace the cube, we'll have to experience it in a meaningful way. We'll have to be taught how to solve it, and if we're going to become part of the Rubik's Cube culture, if we're going to become a regular consumer of Rubik's Cubes, we'll have to have a meaningful experience of the cube. Perhaps somebody we admire will be impressed by our ability with the cube. Perhaps we'll pass the cube on to our children and enjoy competing with them to see who can solve it faster. But notice, if I'm at all convinced by the soundness of the stickers or by the ease of the turning of the cube, I must also find the cube itself to be intrinsically worthwhile. If I care about these things, I have to already care about the cube. And if I'm convinced by the cube because it's a symbol of intelligence, then I must already value intelligence. If I experience the cube positively because it provides me with an opportunity to test my brain against my son's, then I must already value intelligence, competition, and family, and I must already be living within those values, within a family. Every step along the way requires an already existing value that is external to the value I'm testing. My subjective assessment relies upon objective categories. And when I consider myself as truly autonomous, well, I become responsible, deeply responsible. I have to decide what function matters. I have to decide what symbolic order is worthwhile. And I have to decide what experience or meaning is to be embraced. And in each step of this decision-making process, I find myself driven to look for something else, something external to me, something beyond me, to justify my own values. What Castoriadis notices is that in order to be free, we must already be constrained. The world of meaning has to already be present if we're to make choices at all, rather than to merely strike out randomly. And that world of meaning cannot merely be functional. It cannot even be merely symbolic, but rather it has to be imaginary. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.